This is an SM Media production. Hi everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of Chronicle, the Rangers journey, right here on SM Media. I'm Scott McPike. It's a pleasure to be your host as always on this show. We are now at the stage we're going to be the first really show that we look at in a negative fashion. We are now into 2006, the Paul Le Guen project. What happened when Rangers appointed their second foreign manager in 2006 when David Murray pursued the French manager Paul Le Guen and brought him to Ibrox. What follows is a weird story. There's a lot to get into here. It's you would think it's the shortest period I think we'll talk about, but I think probably more news than anything to go through in a short period of time. To join me on this part of the journey from the Gallant Few Podcast, I'm delighted to welcome Colin MacDuff onto the show. Colin, welcome to the Rangers journey. It's an absolute pleasure to have you on.
Hi Scott, hi listeners. It's an absolute pleasure to be on. Thank you very much for inviting me on. You're right, this is a short but very interesting spell in the Murray reign.
Absolutely, yeah. It's David Murray. David Murray's best, I would say. Not best, but he knows what he wants, I would say, at this point. But knowing what you want and actually executing it, as we will talk about later on in this podcast, are two very different things. We'll recap quickly what we spoke about on the last episode. Obviously, the Alex McLeish run had come to an end in weird fashion, although a Champions League last 16, still to this day the only manager for Rangers who's achieved that. Colin, it's fair to say the Alex McLeish run it was time to move on. Once it was time to move into a new project.
It really was. It was the right decision to move Alex McLeish on, and I think project is the right word because we didn't need another Scottish manager. We didn't need a revamp. Well, it felt like we needed something completely different at that point in time because McLeish. Time has been very fond to McLeish, and I think that's fair because he won the treble, he won the double in his first season, then went on to win the treble, then he won another league title. He was a successful manager, but he had to work with really bare bones of transfer budgets and difficult squads. So we did need something completely different and a complete overhaul.
Yeah, we spoke about it last week. I think that's totally accurate. Like McLeish, he had a treble winning squad sold out from under him, which we spoke about, and then wins a title. Obviously, wins a title in remarkable circumstances, and then we see that final season, just the budget he has, some of the signings he makes that we know now, just looking back, they're just really, really poor. But the buzz immediately started. Who was going to be the 12th Rangers manager? We heard names. Various names were mentioned. Graham Souness was linked with a comeback. That was very possible back in the day. I think that's been confirmed that Souness and Murray held talks, and I think it was Souness. I think Souness, to a degree, was keen to get back to where I think still to this day would say was the main place he was successful as a manager. Alan Curbishley, obviously at Charlton, he was linked with the job as well. Bert van Marwijk, the Dutch manager, he was linked with it after leading the Dutch team at that point, but it seemed very early on that the fans' choice and eventually Murray's choice was going to be Paul Le Guen, the former Lyon manager. He'd led Lyon to 3 titles in a row in France. Took a year out to, I think, just to get his kind of a wee sabbatical, I think is the right word. And we were all hearing that he was linked with the likes of Benfica, Lazio, Bayer Leverkusen. He was a commodity. Colin, do you remember the kind of hunt for a manager? Like, what were the kind of early thoughts? Was it always kind of Le Guen? Was it the first name and the only name at that point, do you think?
The big one I remember was Alan Curbishley, and I was giggling away at myself when you mentioned him because he was one of those names that was linked with Rangers every window, basically, every 7 years, every time Rangers drawn at half time. You know how quickly the fans can turn. It's Alan Cubbersley might be interested in Rangers, so it's a long time. So I do remember that, and I do remember the clamour um, for Souness in the media. That was, I think, before Le Guen was mentioned. I do remember Souness being one of the early favourites. I remember when fans at that point spoke about Souness and Smith, there was an air of caution of that whole coming back and ruining a legacy. So as soon as Le Guen's name was mentioned, it was exciting. It's exactly what we needed when I'm saying we needed a complete overhaul. We didn't need another Scottish manager. We needed somebody with European pedigree. Bear in mind, Rangers have still never up until McLeish gets into the last 16 of the Champions League, we've never really been serious with European football throughout the late 90s or early 2000s. So somebody who has got a good pedigree in the continent, really really good Lyon team. He built three championships in a row, and they pulled their weight in Europe. And as soon as that was mentioned, I think that was the overwhelming favourite for fans.
Yeah, the fans were. I think the fans were desperately keen for this to happen, but it doesn't seem like Le Guen was desperate to come. I think there was to be fair to Murray, and we speak about this obviously a couple of times. Murray's had to do this. Murray goes to work and tries to bring him to Ibrox. He takes him to the vineyard. He lays on the banquet. He does everything to try and get Le Guen to Ibrox. Murray obviously fluent in French. He's pulling the charm. I think it's fair to say. I think this is David Murray. This is what when we think about David Murray's legacy and what the very few things that are positive about his legacy in terms of doing deals and being a salesman, and he's good at it. He's really good at it. He does it with Le Guen. Le Guen, I think's a bit cautious. Doesn't want. I think Le Guen's been keen to try British football at this point. I think he's obviously got his eye on replacing Wenger. I don't think that's unfair to say, but there was excitement when it was announced on the 11th of March that Paul Le Guen was going to take over, and immediately it was, who's going to come? Who's the players? It was the parallels of 1998 with Advocat are there to see. You've got a World Cup in the horizon. You've got a foreign manager coming in. You've got all these links in the media. Murray out saying, we'll touch on what he comes out with later in a few minutes, but Murray's out saying the manager's going to get back. There's that buzz around the club, particularly with a foreign manager, that this is going to be a new revolution. And at that time, you would think a much needed revolution because the culture at the club was all wrong. As you said, Colin, it needed a European stamp on it. It needed something different to what we'd seen in the previous years.
Yeah, and that's when you mentioned about the World Cup there. So just for context, I was 14 coming up for 15 at this point. And it's the first time I remember watching the World Cup with my interest being who's Rangers going to sign for this World Cup, because that was how it was painted to the fans. I think Murray's words were big changes coming, and we've got big plans. I think he had a couple of press conferences where he spoke about the plans for Le Guen. He's going to be backed, and the new retail deal with JJB, which was going to completely bankroll every new signing, and look how well that turned out. So at this point, we still, as a fan base, we were still taking what Murray said at face value. So that period didn't end too excitedly, but I remember being really, really excited and looking forward to that summer. Just reading the papers every day on the way to school, jumping up to the shop to get the papers, reading all of them, seeing like who we're going to buy. It was a buzz.
Yeah, there was a buzz, and the rumours were getting quick and who was going to come in. And Murray was famous in the press for saying that this new dawn was going to be a massive moonbeam of success. That rang a bell. That quote.
It does. I was trying to remember the phraseology he used, because I remember he had the wee slogan. That was it. And that's when you talk about the David Murray charm, it wasn't just on an individual basis. He found a way time and time again. He charmed the Rangers support and charmed the media eventually as well. Eventually it does wear off. And We'll come to that. You'll come to that in later
I think
episodes.
this. I think this is it. I think this is the beginning of that. I think this is the first time you see the moonbeam. I think this is the one Murray would take back. I think if you asked him, if they said if there's one thing you could take back for saying this would be it, because it's just become a symbol for people to beat him with, and there was an overall feeling of positivity. There absolutely was, and you mentioned there about the retail deal, so we'll touch on that. This was the time that Rangers had signed the famous 10-year, £48 million deal with JJB. 18 million been given to the club up front that season. Was thought to be what was going to be Le Guen's budget. It was going to get this massive cash injection, and it was going to be a massive, as we say, it was going to be a massive pot of cash for the new manager to put his own stamp on the squad. But the irony of this thing is this is actually a drop in Rangers' retail deal at the time. Rangers, although it looks 10 years, 48 million deals, Rangers were making more than that in their retail at this point. Rangers had got a really good deal out of Nick Peel, who was the commercial director, who's actually, I think when you look back in this time, I think him, Campbell Ogilvie, who kind of leave at this time, they're both really underrated figures. Nick Peel had made a lot of money for Rangers, obviously the famous deal with Diadora. The commercial revenue at this time was really good, and this JJB deal seemed to be the kind of, not just the end of that kind of. Peel was leaving in 2005, and so did Ogilvie. There was a lot of talk at the time that this was Martin Bain, who was going into chief executive. He was going to be the new kind of guy making all these decisions. But that JJB deal, that's when you see that 18 million being given to the club up front, that's people were thinking this is Le Guen's budget. This is what Le Guen's going to have, and this is a real new start for the club. And here we go. This is a massive change in the culture, and just this is a new era.
In hindsight, it was the beginning of the rapid downfall, because this is the point where all decisions made at that level were about the immediate cash injection.
Yeah.
So we didn't focus on how much we're going to lose over the next 5-10 years is that £80 million now, and we now know that wasn't for the transfers. That was, to keep the banks at bay. But I really kind of reiterate that this is probably why the Le Guen era is such a come down, because how much weight of expectation we had for the coach himself, and how it was almost as if the club's football structure was moving with it as well. We're bringing in this new manager, similar to how we've seen it move from Smith in the 90s to Advocat. There was a culture change in the club, and this just felt like the next change coming along.
The one and only transfer window of Paul Le Guen's Rangers career is, the only word for it is bizarre. Like, you've got the links in the press. I was looking through this before we come on, and just some of the names were linked. Gregory Coupe, obviously at Lyon with Le Guen, Sidney Govou, Johan Gossov. There was even links with Fabien Barthez. There was a lot of talk at the time that this was going to be a French Revolution. Who was the names you remember at that time being linked with and getting excited about? I remember Gregory Coupe and thinking, that's exactly that could be massive. There's so many players that were getting linked, and you were just like, Rangers could still attract big players.
I argued until I was blue in the face with my pals who were Celtic fans about how Sidney Govou was going to be the top goal scorer in Scotland that season, and I genuinely couldn't comprehend Rangers not winning the league with Sidney Govou. And now I should caveat all of this with 14-year-old, still young and naive, and believe everything I see in the papers. I'm a far cry for that, but it's in the papers and it's strongly linked and here and there, and so that was the big one for me. And Dado Porcho had been a massive player for McLeish. While he remained there, we could tell, we signed him with no knees, so managing to get 2 seasons at him was phenomenal. But we knew he wasn't going to be the answer for going forward. So it was the big striker who was going to come in. My favourite one, the one that I really didn't believe in, this genuinely was, I think it was the son that Zinedine Zidane would consider coming out of retirement, and one of the clubs he may consider is Rangers. And I thought, it's a bit of a stretch. But at that point in time, it wasn't like that was the kind of bizarre rumours that were going about. Anybody who'd ever played in France or had any sort of French connection, they were getting linked. And well, that is the Zidane one is mental. I think it's hard to appreciate now how much a pull Paul Le Guen would have had on the continent.
Yeah.
Like he was a big name.
He absolutely was. He was. I mean, we're thinking like he turns down like Benfica and Lazio. Like they're not nothing clubs. They're big names in European football. And as you say, I remember talk about the Zidane one, but that was never that was a paper. Nice to see in 2022 that hasn't changed. There's some weird links in the still to this day, but early signings. You look at a few of the early signings. Libor Czech international, positive. Jeremy Clement. I think the whole plan was Ferguson and Clement was going to be the midfield, and Clement was this young talent that Rangers were going to build, and similar to Van Bronckhorst, they were going to sell on for big money. And Karel Svensson from Gothenburg. I think with Swedish defenders, there's this myth that they're all brilliant and they're all hard men, and Karel Svensson certainly put one to that. But there's promising start. When you look at the first three signings and the age more than anything as well, that these are kind of proper, decent acquisitions at the time. There's still positivity at this time that these are big signings going forward.
Aye, that's it. That was the thing for me. Like, well, these weren't your marquee signings that we were expecting. For Lieber and Karl Svensson, they were both in the World Cup squads in Germany for Czech Republic and Sweden. So, well, I think they only got one game each. But back to this, right? If this is the level that we're aiming at, we are getting international players. It's exciting. So when these first three signings came in, it was right, okay, this is a good start. Like, these guys will absolutely complement whoever the marquee signing will be. And Jeremy Clement, there was a lot of excitement for him as well, because he had, he had, I think at that point, same way as Svensson, I think they had maybe 100 odd games under the belt at top tier football, and they were only 22. So, like, these were young players with massive potential who were coming in to start and develop into something bigger.
The next one is the one that raised eyebrows for a lot of people. The Rangers, they finally got their goalkeeper. We thought maybe Fabien Barthez, Gregory Coupé. It was a French international, but it wasn't them. It was Lino Letizia, 33-year-old goalkeeper from, I think he came from Paris Saint-Germain. This one's weird. This one, even now, when you look at it, when you look at the names Rangers are linked with, he's 33-year-old. He's not a massive name. I mean, he played against Rangers for PSG. We knew of him, but when you look at who they were linked with, even obviously the famous story about Murray had told members of supporters groups that he was signing Steve Mandanda. There's a big difference between a 33-year-old Lionel Letizia and even a 23-year-old Gregory Coupé at that point. Like, this is weird when you look back at it.
It's like one of those memes, like when you order off a Wish. And yeah, it was. And this one was, it was hard to gauge. Okay, is he coming in to be the replacement for like Ronald Vateris or Gosset number one, or is he a backup keeper? So at that point, if it was two schools of thought, if you are the optimist, it's like, okay, we'll wait and see. We'll maybe have a plan for a number one to come in, and then the real, I was about to say the pessimist, but actually it was the realist. Well, like, no, this is our number one keeper. This is it was strange, because even at the peak of his career, he was never really like a top tier goalie. He was never an established great number one. And Rangers, like, for as long as I've been born, we've always prided ourselves on having, like, building for the back and having amazing goalkeepers. And we had Kloss and Vateris the season before, and this was a major downgrade.
There's more signings to talk about. Obviously, we'd mentioned Libor Sionka, who came from Austria Vienna. I'll just say, keep that name in mind. Austria Vienna. Keep that name in the top of your mind, listeners, because we'll talk about them a few times in the next couple of minutes. two exciting youngsters though coming in for Man United, Lee Martin and Phil Barsley. I remember being exciting, particularly with Lee Martin. Do you remember he absolutely destroyed Celtic at Parkhead in a friendly? There was a big talk that Lee Martin was going to rip up Scottish football. Rangers had tried to sign a striker. I think there was chat about Johan Omandorf, who obviously were on and done well at Bolton, but Austria Vienna, we mentioned them just a second ago, and Rangers spent £2 million on a striker from them called Philip Zebo. This I remember, leading to questions as what is going on here? Why are Rangers signing another player from Austria Vienna? And they would only get fueled a few days later when Rangers spent more money bringing a third player in from Austria Vienna by the name of Sasa Papac. What is going on here?
It was really strange. Like, we see it now with Rangers. You know, they'll maybe target the Croatian league or the Eastern European league. So to target an untapped area, that absolutely makes sense. That's good scouting. To just pick a club and take 3 of the first team players, it felt lazy at best, and just, I don't know, a bit dodgy at worst. It was really strange, and it wasn't. I think Leivers Uncle was the highest profile out of the three of them. Czech international, and you know, he's a bit more established. I think he was older than, maybe a couple of years older than Papac and Sebo, and he'd been in and around the Czech Republic squad for a while. So he was the bigger name. So you kind of understand that. But Sebo and Papac, that was, you know, that it was bemusement more than anything.
Bemusement's the word for it. I mean, I remember at the time phone-ins and why are Rangers signing 3 players from Austria Vienna? Why is Le Guen not getting all this money that was promised? I mean, his budget's £3 million. Paul Le Guen sitting in the vineyards getting told you're getting £3 million and you're getting 3 players from Austria Vienna? Because if Paul Le Guen's getting told that, then I would be astonished.
Aye, and that's why we were so confused, and you know, maybe starting to ask the questions, because we all know a manager, Paul Le Guen's caliber at that point, it doesn't come to. I've just looked up Sebo's scoring record there. I knew it was something poor. It was 6 in 32 appearances for Austria Vienna. That's not going to sell you the Rangers job when you can go to Italy or Spain or back to France. So I think fans were right to, you know, I don't think it was panic stations at this point, but we were starting to question, right, okay, let's wait and see what happens between now and the rest of the window, hoping that Murray's got something up his sleeve.
Yeah, and you mentioned there, obviously, Murray, and the questions do come to his door. Why is he not getting the funds that were promised? Why is this all we're getting? Like that, I remember that at the time, but the summer, it wasn't without controversy. I think that's fair to say. And I think Le Guen, to be fair to him, I think he stamped his authority very quickly. Obviously, the famous incident with Fernando Rickson, who the pre-season tour of South Africa, it can only be described as an alcohol-fueled incident on the plane. And then you laugh at this when you actually think about it. Shoving John McClelland into a swimming pool. That's funny. That's funny.
That's a Fernando we loved.
Yeah, that's a Fernando we loved. And you feel bad, obviously. You feel bad talking about Fernando in this way, but I think a lot of people agreed that this was like stamping and making tough decisions to ensure team discipline. Rickson was sent out on loan to reunite with Dick Advocat at Zenit, and it felt at the time, and it was a sad way for Rickson to end his career. And we know, obviously, we've touched on Fernando Rickson, what a warrior he was in his the final battle he had in his life. But at this point, it did feel like this was the right thing. Le Guen got a lot of credit for doing this because it was stamping his authority quickly, and this was a no-nonsense manager who was going to come in and just make tough decisions.
Aye, and it was sad at that point because Rickson was the captain that, you know, led us to Helicopter Sunday in Easter Road, and he was wonderful for McLeish that season. The season after, he wasn't great. I mean, amongst others, he didn't really live up to his potential to play the best of his ability, and he always, like, all through Fernando Rickson's career, he was a bit of a live wire, and so he could be unpredictable when he wasn't fully focused. So at that point, well, it's sad to see, a great servant to the club go. It was a bit encouraging that this is, this is the standard expected at Rangers. And going back to that overhaul that we were expecting to come back, like, okay, this is a new regime, and we're absolutely not going to accept anything below par.
Yeah, and it's, as you say, it's just a sad way for Rickson's Rangers career to end. But the first game of the Le Guen era, 2-1 away win over Motherwell, I filled the Rangers fans with a lot of hope. There was a lot of attractive football on display, but it was a beginning. It was a false dawn. What do you remember about that Motherwell game? Because I remember that time thinking this is the way. It was a 4-4-2. Tionco looked really good. Clement, I remember Clement looking brilliant. I mean, you look back in this game, Rangers played some terrific stuff.
Aye, and what was really good to see, because we were so used to maybe Chris Buck on the right and Hamid Namucci on the left, who was basically playing like a second left back under McLeish at times. And it was good to see two wide men having a go at the Motherwell defence. Lee Martin on the left, Sionko on the right, and we still had the likes of Thomas Buffel to come on Nacho Novo, and it was looking as if we were, and also the unknown entity Philip Sebo at that point, but it was Clement. Jeremy Clement had a great game. I remember that, and you're like, wow, Rangers typically don't start seasons very well. So if this is where we're starting, where are we going to go under this new management team?
Yeah, as we say, it turned out to be a false dawn. The next two draws against Dundee United and Dunfermline, immediate concerns are raised about the defence, particularly Svensson and Letizia. I mean, you'll remember any cross ball that was coming into the box, it was a likely goal. The Svensson and Letizia just looked miles off it, didn't they?
Aye, and we speak about it on the pod all the time. We're a very unforgiving crowd, and
yes,
we're very hard to win over at the best of times, never mind win back. So Svensson got a bit more leeway. He was young and there was a bit more hype about him. Because we were never really sold in Lionel Letizia, the jury was out, and there was a lot of moaning groans very early on. And to be fair, he didn't do himself very many favours, but that was the big warning signs that predicting that season, okay, we're going to maybe take 3-4 off teams, but they're going to take a couple off us, and we need to address that defence.
Yeah, and it keeps going on. I mean, wins against Hearts and Falkirk did show the progress. There was progress, but the defeat against Hibs at Easter Road, 3 wins for 7 league games, heading into the first Old Firm of the season against Celtic at Parkhead. That game's a strange one. We'll touch on why in a minute. But Thomas Gravesen scores for Celtic early on, and then Kenny Miller comes back to haunt Rangers. Had obviously signed for Celtic in that summer. This is alarm bells, because defensive woes are apparent, and going forward, Rangers played well. I think Rangers did play some decent stuff, but at the back they were just a basket case.
Aye, that's probably the first game I had concerns about Clement as well. I think going forward, as you said, we played well and we looked as if we were going to be able to create, but basket case to the back, absolutely. But in the back and in the middle of the park, we looked as if we lacked the fight and lacked the aggression, and I think that's when I first really felt that we maybe seen some of the more industrious teams in the league, like the Motherwell. They would, it's a physical league, so you maybe gave the benefit of the doubt. It'll take these players a bit of time to settle into that, but just aggression and desire. I mean, I think for memory of that game, it only really felt like Barry Ferguson was, the screamer, but even then it wasn't really having any impact. So that was the big alarm bells for me, that, right, Celtic just wanted that more in top of being the better team.
Yeah, and it's not. We look back in that Celtic team. It isn't a vintage Celtic team. It's
an
effective Celtic team. I think they do their job well, but you're talking about Celtic teams over the years. This isn't a top class Celtic team. But the post match comments of Le Guen, I want to touch on them because they raised a worry for a few groups of fans. I went on to I typed in this into Google the other day, and there was things at the time that this was raising alarm bells. Le Guen said after the game, there are no miracles in football, and there was hope that, although that defeat had kind of thought Rangers aren't what we thought it isn't what we thought it would be, there was still hope, I would say, at this point. But behind the scenes, you've got a manager who I think it's fair to say is questioning whether this is the right place for him. And after that Celtic game, Paul Le Guen walks into David Murray's office and tells him he was thinking of resigning as manager. He cited the reasons. This has all come out recently, that he thought the players were not behind him and his vision for the club. Murray, knowing how embarrassing this would be, I think he was taken aback that this was happening so early. And Paul Le Guen's only in the door 2 months at this point, and he's thinking about, he's already at the stage of, this isn't for me. I think we'll touch on what becomes clear later on, but Murray knew this he couldn't have a manager walking out after 2 months. So Murray, to be fair to him, he keeps him on, he persuades him to stay on, but it's already heading down a dangerous path, isn't it, at this point, when you're 2 months into a job and you're playing in your first Old Firm game and you walk into and tell the chairman that's brought you in and done a lot of work to bring you in, and has been, I think, a massive coup on Murray's part to bring him in and telling him this isn't going to work, and already it's an uphill struggle for that point, I would say.
Absolutely, and there's a couple of things there. Probably the public image for Le Guen at that point, before we know it, everything we know now about that conversation had with Murray, to come out and say there's no miracles in football when, let's face it, it's Celtic are your only real challengers for the league at that point, and to even suggest it's a miracle to compete with them. If that's what he's saying in the public, then what is he saying to the players, and what message is he saying to the players? That's massive alarm bells, and it shouldn't have took Le Guen to walk into Murray's door for Murray to realise that this isn't going to go well. I don't know if it's hard to say in hindsight. Was it the right decision at that point to keep him on? Should you have cut your losses there and then? But what I would say is, I have no doubt in my mind that David Murray didn't act in the best interest of Rangers Football Club here. He wanted to save face for David Murray.
Absolutely, yeah. That's exactly. That's why he's still there. That's why he doesn't. He tries to keep him on. Murray must know. You can usually tell when you speak to somebody, and you can tell with their body language that they're not in the best place, and this isn't the place for them. And Murray must have seen that in Le Guen. And again, you've got to say, for Le Guen to go in there and say this isn't going to work. I am admitting to you, I can't do this. I can't do this job. It takes a lot of guts, in a sense, to say, open up and admit it. But the reason I want to bring this up as well is that the high point in the reign of Le Guen's obviously the run in UEFA Cup and qualifying against Molde, entering the new group stage. They topped their group with 3 wins and a draw. They became Le Guen he's the first manager to take a Scottish team to Italy and win. They beat Livorno 3-2. They beat the likes of Maccabi Haifa and Partizan Belgrade. What was so different in Europe? It's an impressive European run, but how could this not translate to domestic? It was a different animal in Europe. Was it the pressure of the home, the domestic bubble that we live in Scottish football?
Le Guen could never get to grips with the kick and rush, the high tempo nature of Scottish football, and almost the lack of football is a high intensity physical game, and you're not afforded the luxury of making your stamp and getting your free flowing football on. And I think that was clear what he was trying to do. I think it was clear what he was trying to do in the league, and especially with the attacking style of play. It just wasn't working out. So the European game, where you do get a bit more at that point, you do get a bit more time in the ball. There's less of a physicality, and I think that the players that he was relying on for especially the attacking play, they thrived under that. I think Thomas Buffel as well. I think he was a big player from the McLeish, and Smith wasn't a fan of him, but Buffel doesn't get a lot of plaudits for the Le Guen era, but he was excellent in Europe for them. I remember that. The likes of Sionco as well, and Jeremy Clement came into play, and I thought Clement and Ferguson, along with him, Danny. I don't know if you remember, it was kind of like the 4-3-1-2
Yeah,
that they played with Felchers was running him. That midfield three, him, Danny sitting, and Ferguson just dictating play at the tempo, with Clement just being allowed to be neat and tidy in the ball and choose recycle the ball. It works really well. And again, it's just because that style of play they could afford. What Le Guen and team when they good at was adapting to a different style, a style that they didn't want to play.
November the 8th, 2006. Do you remember that night?
I should know. Is that the cup game?
That's a cup game. Rangers take on St Johnstone in the League Cup. I think a lot of people think it's going to be a routine cup tie against a first division team, but no, it is not. Rangers lose the game 2-0 at home. Stephen Milne scores 2 goals, and Rangers are out of the domestic cup to a first division team. The first time that would ever happen. I remember I was at that game that night. The atmosphere around the Ibrox was toxic, and the protests after the game, and I think it wasn't just about how poor results were. It was aimed at Murray as well. It wasn't just about Le Guen and how bad the performances were. It was, what is going on here? Why is this investment not happened? Why are Rangers in this position? Rangers should never be going out to a first division team in a cup. Never, especially at home. And that night just felt like that would be the turning point for a lot of fans who wanted to buy into the Caixinha. The Caixinha, I think, suffered the same. A lot of fans wanted to be right and wanted to back him as much as possible, but there comes a point where you just can't. And I think that was that night. It just turned that night. I just remember the atmosphere. I don't think I've ever seen it as toxic as it was that night.
And it was actually quite toxic before the full time as well. As soon as we got an indication that it wasn't your night, we didn't play well at all. This wasn't what you sometimes see in cup games where Rangers or Celtic will have 90% possession and they hit the bar and there's shot after shot and the other team nicks it. St Johnstone were the better team. We were just poor from start to finish, and that turned the crowd really, really quickly. And it just, as you say, it's hard to remember a more toxic atmosphere. We said at the start, but a very unforgiving crowd, and we didn't hold back at that point. Am I right in saying that the post match press conference that night, that's the one where he's just kept on saying, I'm sorry, it's not good enough.
Yeah.
And I remember seeing that in the news the next day, thinking, right, you need to hold your hands up, but it didn't. You felt you lost a bit of respect for him because he just looked under pressure, didn't he?
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. I think at this point he knows he can't turn it round. He knows within himself, even if he wanted to, it's just not going to last. It's you know as well as I do. If you're in a job and immediately you just get alarm bells that this isn't for you, it's not going to change. Your mind's made up within yourself. You're not, even if it turns out to be, you could be promised the world, you could be promised more money, you could be promised a blitz in January. It's your mind's gone. Your mind's gone, and it's as well. We don't talk about this often enough. It's a different culture, and that in my mind is the whole thing. Le Guen, not only did he not understand Scottish football, he didn't want to at this point. I wouldn't say he was working his ticket, because he obviously was going out every week wanting Rangers to win. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that you just could. It just wasn't going to be long term at this point. His mind was gone, and I think that night, as you say, I totally forgot all about that. It was almost as if it reminded you of a bit of a child just desperate for somebody to just give him a hug. That's what it reminded you of. Just like, somebody come and help me. Somebody just take me away from this. And that's what that
was. And knowing what we know now, when he's went and absolutely, he was brave to call out, this isn't for me, this isn't working out. But then be coerced into staying, and then he's in that position. Like, you do feel bad for him a bit. Like,
you do. And the next, do you remember the press conference a few days later?
is that the one with David Murray? And it's basically that. So you've said the perfect analogy that he was like a child, and you just want somebody to hug him. And this press conference was the child upset in the playground, and the teacher coming out holding his hand saying, "Play nice with Paul Le Guen, please."
Yes, and Murray. This is Murray in a nutshell. This is Murray not wanting to admit to himself that this is on me. He's in that press conference, and the famous statement that if he puts it in the players, and his words were, and this is a quote: "If the players don't get their act together, then they will be playing for clubs like Bristol Rovers." I mean, I don't know what to say to that, and I've watched it, read it, and Le Guen's just sitting there, and you do think about Le Guen at this point. You're thinking, what is he thinking? Like, what is going through his mind at this point? Is Murray's come out to back his man? He doesn't want to admit to himself that he's made a mistake. He doesn't want to admit to himself that this isn't going to work. But to come out with a statement like that, and that's Murray in a nutshell, just not admitting that not admitting to yourself and admitting to the fans that this isn't what's going to, this is wrong, and everybody can see it's wrong. You look at that press conference, nothing goes through my mind other than this is Paul Le Guen needs taken out of this situation, because this is not in the best interest of Rangers and Paul Le Guen. You're watching a man literally crumble before you, and Murray's sitting there putting it all on the players and determined to keep Le Guen and put Le Guen through this misery.
And that's David Murray didn't sack managers. Like, we've
No,
seen
he
it
didn't.
Late 90s. A lot of people wanted Walter Smith to go in the 10, what should have been the 10 in a row season.
Murray has to be forced into making this decision. Murray doesn't have a choice at the end up, and that's exactly it. He just couldn't admit to himself that this wasn't working.
Aye, and you're totally right. It's that press conference wasn't for the benefit of Paul Le Guen. That was still the David Murray show, to say, for him to save face, exactly like it was for coercing Paul Le Guen to stay when they didn't want to go. It was to save face for him to come out and say, "No, this isn't my fault. I've made the right decision. The players haven't bought into it." That's him saying, "No, I've done everything above board. You need to change."
David Murray blaming other people. That's the symbol of this
He's
show.
made a living out of it.
And he did it the season before as well. We spoke about it in the last episode, coming out and saying McLeish has got 5 games to save his job. He doesn't win any of them. McLeish stays because he doesn't want to sack him. He doesn't want to admit this isn't working. And that's Murray in a nutshell. But league woes would intensify with poor defeats at home to Inverness, and Dundee United and Falkirk away defeats as well. Defensive errors are, at this point, it's amateur hour. And you remember some of the defensive partnerships. I mean, Papach, we both love Sasa Papach as our left back, but as a centre back, no, he isn't. And the likes of Hamdani playing in there and Carol Svensson at this point, I don't think I've ever seen a defender just not cut out for Rangers in Scottish football than Carol Svensson. And Letizia would eventually be replaced. Obviously, Alan McGregor would come in. He would make the number 1 shot his own. He'd waited for his opportunity. I mean, God bless him. I think he must have had plenty of chances to walk out the door. But he stayed on and he gets his chance. And McGregor just goes on and is, in my opinion, is one of the best Rangers careers of all time. And this is where it kicks off, and it becomes his.
Just to think, if we did sign a better keeper, he might not have got that chance. So
Yeah.
do we thank Paul Le Guen for McGregor's career? Maybe a bit of a stretch, but it's funny. Just on the before we wax cynical about Alan McGregor, because I can do that all night long.
Yeah.
I love the man. When you spoke about working his ticket for the Inverness game, I actually think that as well, because McGregor was in for maybe 6-7 games before this, and this was the game he's just randomly brought Letizia back in.
Yeah, I remember that.
He's just trying to wind us up now, isn't he?
And it's that thing as well when behind the scenes Le Guen isn't happy, and the dressing room at this point I don't think it's a happy camp. And Le Guen, French football is different to Scottish football, and it's a better standard of quality, yes. But at Lyon, I think if Lyon go to a team, and I'm just using this as an example, if Lyon go to a team like Non and draw one each away from home, it's not a disaster. And to go from that to Scottish football, where if you lose 2-1 to Inverness and you lose a late goal, fans are baying for your blood. And we know that. And that's Scottish football, and that's the weird mental thing of Scottish football when Le Guen just didn't get that. And that attitude of brushing defeats off, and you've got men in there like Barry Ferguson, we'll touch on it in a few minutes, but Le Guen just didn't understand that poor results like that, just they're not acceptable. You can't draw it. You can't draw away to Falkirk. You can't lose at home to Inverness and just brush it off and say we improve the next game. You can't do that.
No, and we've seen it more recently with Mark Warburton coming up, and
yeah,
he thought he was going to get a bye because it was his first season in the top flight. But it's we've been like this since since over 150 years now. We're not going to change. You need to change for us. It's where it's right, wrong, and different. The expectation on Rangers is always going to be there, and that it is one of the few clubs in the world where you are expected to win every game. And Walter Smith always said it beautifully. Most most big clubs, you're only as good as your last game. At Rangers, you're only as good as your last pass. There's plenty, thousands of examples where we've won 1-0 at Ibrox and no played well, and came away raging.
mm-hmm.
It's just but a different beast.
It's a different culture, and it's that. I mean, some of the media reports at this time are absolutely nonsense. You've got the famous Le Shopnator or something, where they literally had his head in a guillotine saying, when is he going to go? And that's nonsense. But
you probably have touched on it in the last couple of episodes as well. That'll be Murray as well. Anybody in the media can use Rangers as fair game as long as David Murray isn't attacked. And I think the media really did jump on the funny foreigner here. And the weird thing is they didn't have to look too far just to criticise his football and tactics, but it was there was an air of xenophobia about it as well, wasn't it? Very much like Pedro Caixinha.
Yes, and I think you've touched on something very, very noticeable there, that there is this difference of a lot of Scottish players, a lot of Scottish managers, like with results like this, would get time because they're mates with the press. Do you know what I mean? Like that's, and we saw it with Caixinha. We even saw it across the city with Ronnie Dyla and likes of Dr. Joe. Like if it's not working and you're not part of the clique, you don't last. And the media in Scotland are so weird, and we've touched on it in previous episodes, and we'll touch on it probably in later episodes. But let's touch back onto the on-field stuff. Le Guen at this point, I think, is just he's looking for a way out. I think he's just desperate for something just to happen. But results do improve. I mean, don't get me wrong. A home wins over Hibs and Aberdeen, and that Hemdani late equaliser against Celtic, it showed there was slight improvement in league form, but that dressing room disharmony would come to a head in the 27th of December up in Inverness, a 2-1 defeat. Winning the game 1-0, losing 2 late goals, and Le Guen again went in and said, we must stick together, we must carry on, we move forward. And I think Barry Ferguson, I don't think he was alone, and we will go into that in detail in a few minutes, the whole situation between those two. But Ferguson questioned the manager, like, don't tell us this is okay, because this is Rangers Football Club and it isn't. The attitude was, this isn't acceptable, and Rangers at this point on third place, 17 points behind Celtic. The league's over, and Le Guen's telling the Rangers dressing room that this is fine, we must carry on, and it wasn't okay. And Ferguson, I don't think Ferguson covers himself in glory in this, and we'll speak about it in a minute, but it's coming to a head.
Aye, how Ferguson goes about. This is probably the beginning of the downfall of Ferguson as well.
Yes,
Because
it is.
it's the first nail. That's his last warning, but he doesn't. He thinks it. You'll get it. You'll get to it, and when Walter returns, but he doesn't have a constant buy. So how he goes about it's probably the wrong way, but the message he's saying is spot on. It's not acceptable, and somebody did have to stand up. But I do think it's really interesting when you look at how we view Paul Le Guen's grasp on the players and the dressing room and how quickly it changed. For sending Fernando Rickson away because he just doesn't uphold that right standards behaviour. But then I don't know if you remember around October, November time there was a dispute with Phil Bardsley in Le
Yeah,
Guen. And I think it was something to do with Le Guen's asked for no. The
yeah,
rumours at the time,
banned tackling.
ban tackles and Bardsley, ever the hothead, I think he flies into Plymouth or something. But I remember at that point, that's when the media and the fans started to question, was that the right thing?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I can only guess that at this point the players are starting to question, right, what's going on here as well, because we won the winning, and then it just comes to a halt here when the club captain, although he's always been a big presence at every club he goes to, the streamer, he's always been like that. So I can only imagine it wasn't. Paul, may I have a word, please? It was a full-blown shouting match in the dressing room.
Yeah, and it was. I've spoke to people who were in that dressing room that day, and that's exactly what happened. And it's that thing you just touched on as well. If Rangers are winning, if Rangers are 17 points clear at the top of the league, the banning tackling and things like that, it's probably seen as revolutionary. It's probably seen as this is how to do it. And when you're not winning and you're making these decisions, I mean, with the famous thing about that's been labelled the Monster Munch Brigade, like he banned, I think he banned a lot of stuff. I think he banned ketchup and things like that. Like he wanted, and Scottish football does not like imports coming in and telling them how to do it. Then that's players are like that as well. Right? You could count in one hand how many foreign managers really last and really change the culture at the club. That doesn't happen very often, and there's a reason for that. It's because Scottish football players are used to a certain way, and I'm not defending it. I think at times it needs to be done. It needs to be done differently. But the likes of banning Monster Munch and things like that when you're looking for reasons to be disappointed in a situation, and you immediately think to that, and the dressing room is splitting at that point, and another 2 points get dropped 3 days later at home to St Mirren, and I will never forget this. And I just remember Ferguson sitting in the middle of the park that day, just gutted. Rangers took the lead really early. I think St Mirren equalised about 20 minutes, and in 70 minutes, Rangers just don't pressure to get a winning goal. When you just see Ferguson, I think Ferguson was knocking his pan in, and I think it just comes to a head that day. I think you just see a frustrated Ferguson, and Le Guen's saying the same thing. Oh, this isn't a disaster, let's carry on, and it just blows up completely in the dressing room at Ibrox that day.
Aye, that was, as a fan, I remember, and this is when you know it's bad. You're not angry anymore. You're just, I don't know, you're just so demotivated, and when you're angry, you're like, this must be better. This will blah blah blah. When you're demotivated like that, you just don't see how this is going to improve, and that's how I felt, and I can only imagine that's how Barry Ferguson felt as well. And it's hard to say like when should have done X, Y, and Z at this point in time when he clearly doesn't want to be there. But if at this point this was a manager who still did want to be there, like see the stuff that you're talking about, like changing the culture and that, I think when you talk about it's hard to a former manager to come in, they don't have that sense of realism that you need to balance it out as well. So like banning Monster Man, getting everybody on like a 0% body fat diet, that's a great idea. It's not going to happen in 6 months.
No.
You still need to maintain and win that at the same time. And I think that's probably where the biggest clash was, where there's this, Le Guen coming in with a good pedigree of football, and he wants to play the game the right way. And I think he said himself, and we've said it time and time again on this, that he didn't understand football, Scottish football. He didn't do his research, and he didn't learn to embrace it quick enough. He was going to change it in his mind, and like in his head, like football should be played this way, and he didn't want to change. It's not just that the players didn't want to adapt to him. He didn't want to accept it. No, but I can't. I need to get two big guys at the back. If with my centre halves, I can't have the free flowing football and Carl Svensson or whatever it was meant to be. And I think I can only imagine. Like I feel every emotion that Barry Ferguson would have been screaming at that point, because that's what it is. It's we need to win. We need to. This isn't good enough, aye. So it's the one thing Barry Ferguson had on his side was, as a fan base, we felt the exact same way.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly it. And you've touched on so many good points there that no matter how much you want to change the culture, if you're not winning, you can't. And when New Year's Day, we're sitting down to a steak pie, and about probably, well, I'm 11 at this point. I don't know what you are, but Barry Ferguson gets called into Le Guen's office and doesn't even get the chance to sit down. Le Guen tells him, "You are finished at this club. You'll never play again." Strips him of the captaincy, and Ferguson leaves the training ground. Now, Ferguson immediately contacts the media and tells him the situation that had happened. And Murray did not know this was coming. Murray knew nothing. The weird thing about this is that Le Guen tells Murray after calling Ferguson in. That to me is a man, in my opinion, you might disagree, but that is a man wanting Murray to take action. This is the tipping point. This is Le Guen saying, "I need to do this. This is my way out."
You're spot on. Le Guen knows by this point that if he goes to Murray with a problem, Murray's just going to tell him why he's wrong and why everything's actually okay, and
Absolutely.
the world is nice and rosy.
Yes.
Le Guen's clocked on to the Murray charm, and he's took action. And it's see, if you watch this in a sitcom, just a guy walking stick at it thinking, how can I get sacked? In any other workplace it'd be funny, but when it's an emotive workplace like a football club, it's it was just, at that point you're like, wow, this has been a laughing stock this season, and this is just embarrassing. The manager stripping the captaincy, and to rub salt into the wounds, appointed Gavin Ray the captain. It's hardly fills you with confidence, that replacement.
And that's the thing. And you mentioned there about Gavin Ray. That I've spoke to Gavin Ray on my channel. Gavin Ray's a lovely, lovely man. Gavin Ray, all due respect, should never have been Rangers captain. And Le Guen, I think, again, hangs Gavin Ray out to dry. But Le Guen's thing at that point, and it said it earlier on in the season, what the captaincy isn't important. Now, to Rangers fans, that is not the case. But we have grown up with. I mean, my favourite captain is Barry Ferguson because he's the one I remember. But ask Terry Butcher, Richard Gough. I mean, before that, John Gregg, Jock Shaw. Before that, the Rangers captaincy does mean something, and that was what Le Guen didn't get. You can't just knock the captaincy out the window. It's a symbol of Rangers Football Club, and that saying that he didn't share their fans' appreciation for the captaincy, nobody in their wildest dreams thought Gavin Ray should have been the Rangers captain. And that's no knocking Gavin Ray. But Gavin Ray's admitted that himself to me.
No, you're right. Gavin Ray was a decent player. Like, it's just wasn't what we needed at that point, I don't think, but he was a decent player and in the right team, he would have fitted in.
The fascinating thing with that is, and I've just remembered this, Gavin Ray thought he was getting called in to be sold. That's how far away Gavin Ray was from that position.
Exactly. And you make a good point there that Le Guen was very open about the captaincy, and that's just back to that. He didn't want to accept that, not just Rangers, but Scottish football, British football is different. He didn't want to accept that there was a bit of adaptation because in Britain there is a much higher regard for the captaincy than across the continent, and it's just it's a different style, and like that's just one of the number of things you'll have to learn and you'll have to adapt to if you move between countries, and just another thing that at best he didn't comprehend, didn't understand. At worst he knew it and he just thought this is my way out, taking what they hold in such high regard and just throwing it in the mud. That'll get me my ticket.
The final game of this era, actually there's one more game we'll touch on, but Rangers go to Firth Park. The fans there's only one thing, the talk of the town obviously is the situation with Le Guen and Ferguson. Ferguson, I think, has got the fans on his side. You remember the famous statement, "No Barry, no Rangers." That's nonsense. I totally disagreed with that at the time. Still think it's cringe. But Rangers win the game 1-0. Boyd scores a penalty, and the famous six fingers goes up. The tribute to Ferguson. That showed. I think it showed to me. It showed to the fans where the players stood in this feud that was going on at the time between Ferguson and Le Guen. And if you're I don't know how I feel about Chris Boyd showing doing the fingers and things like that. I think it's just undermining the manager's authority a bit. And I get the whole thing of the dressing room were agreeing with Ferguson. The fans were agreeing with Ferguson. Ferguson was right. Ferguson's argument was right. Ferguson's way of going about it was all wrong. But that was the thing. Ferguson had the fans on his side. Ferguson had more respect with the fans. Ferguson was there for years. He had built that trust with the fans. He'd built the admiration. Le Guen hadn't earned that. And I think Le Guen knew that. I think Le Guen knew this was the way to go.
Yeah. What you said there about Boyd showing the six fingers in public, I'm totally on board with the same as you, that we shouldn't be airing our dirty laundry in public.
That's exactly it.
Yeah. It's just another thing to laugh at us with, and that's what it felt like. And you're right, it was very evident that night where the players stood, at least the Scottish players stood behind Ferguson, and you just knew like there wasn't going to be any way back after that night, and back to that point, I wasn't angry anymore. I was just when will that? How does this even get better?
When will it end? But Murray at that point, I think Murray sees the writing on the wall. He absolutely does, and he has to find a resolution. But Le Guen's interview after the game is very interesting because he's asked, "Do you have the backing of David Murray?" And he says yes. He didn't. He absolutely didn't. Murray knew what was happening. We can talk about David Murray's decision making and his carelessness that we'll touch on later on, and his hesitance to make big decisions, but he knows at this point that this has to end. It has to end for everybody's benefit. Rangers in particular makes a phone call that has the replacement in place. We'll touch on that next week, but pulls Le Guen into his office 2 days after the Motherwell game, and yeah, it's agreed that Le Guen's departure is going to be finalised. To Le Guen's credit, he forfeited compensation. He didn't want paid for what he saw as a failed job, but he did ask Murray to pay up the contracts of his staff, which Murray did agree to. Le Guen's time is over, but I think you've got to admire that. Like, he knows it was a failed job, and he makes sure his staff who he'd brought with him, who'd obviously changed their lives, and he'd made sure they were well compensated. I think Le Guen leaves in a bit. I think he earns a bit of respect for that, in my opinion.
It does, and then that's probably why, if I'm looking at the ending of the story, that why I have a bit of sympathy for him when it is going really wrong, because this is a guy who's asked to leave in 2 months into the role, told basically no, and then he just goes through hell, and at the end he's not interested in gaining from it. He just wanted out of that situation, but wanted to make sure that the guys who went through that roller coaster with him were fairly looked after. And that's, you're right. Like, respect is kind of re-established a wee bit there, and it's just, it shouldn't have went on that long. It really shouldn't have.
No, it definitely shouldn't have. But it's all reports says it's an amicable split. Murray and Le Guen, I think they shake hands, and it's all done fairly amicably. But he then pulls Ferguson in. That does not go as amicably. Murray rips through him, absolutely tears him to shreds. Ferguson's agent's in the room as well. Murray warns Ferguson, if you ever step out of line, your time at Rangers Football Club is over. And I don't think Barry Ferguson left that room with that going through his head that would be true. It does ring true a few years later, and we can talk about, as Ferguson's argument was valid. He knew that this wasn't the Rangers standard, but he didn't behave properly, in my opinion. And I'm someone who idolises Barry Ferguson, always have, but his heart was in the right place, I think it's fair to say, but he didn't handle it the best. And Murray's an intelligent man. Murray knows what was going on, and to be fair to him, I think Murray saw it as well as, you're upsetting me, you're ruining my plans. And I think Ferguson probably left that day thinking, oh, that'll calm down. It doesn't.
Yeah, you're spot on. Murray couldn't give a monkeys how much he was upsetting Le Guen, but as soon as it causes him bother, then that's when the issue is. And it was good to see. It was good that Ferguson was brought down to earth a bit, but that message doesn't last if they don't get the next appointment right and bring in Walter Smith. And I know you'll be touching that in the coming weeks. But if they get that appointment wrong and they have they hire a manager with less fortitude and strength and steel than Smith, then Ferguson will just continue being, I'm Barry Rangers, I am Rangers, and that's why that appointment, amongst other reasons, was huge for the squad as well, because that was never going to be tolerated. And actually, a few years down the line, it was off Rangers' duty that he thought he was safe, and he wasn't.
He wasn't indeed. And the Le Guen era comes to an end. We'll get the overall review in a wee minute. But with one last game to go through, Ferguson comes back into the team for a trip to Dunfermline. I can hear screaming already from some fans who are listening to this. So this game, Ian Gerrard comes in. He'd obviously been at the club in a youth capacity, and he takes charge of the first team, and it's a 3-2 defeat, and Rangers' season effectively ends on the 6th of January.
And you know what? That's for me, when I keep on talking about when is this going to end, I thought, right, like Gwen's away, we'll have a teething period, and then things will start to be better. And then it was just Le Guen was at this point in this game, Le Guen's away and we're getting put the cup again. You're like, oh, how long will this go on for? But it's, I don't blame Durant for that. I know he got a lot of heat at the time, but it was an unforgivable situation to be put in, and I'm pretty sure he started Ferguson and Gavin Ray.
Yeah, did you?
Park. Yeah, I don't think they started together before. Before that, I can't really remember.
Gavin Ray was brought in to be Ferguson's replacement.
Aye, so playing both of them, and you're stuck between a rock and a hard place. If you only start Ferguson, does that mean okay? Right, aye, it's Barry Rangers. If you don't start Ferguson, right, does that mean Le Guen was on to something here? Like, what's, yeah. And aye, so it's a tough job for Gerrard. I don't blame him for it, but it doesn't make the memory any less painful.
No, and closing up, obviously Murray goes into he phones an old friend who's doing well at Scotland, and it's It's done pretty quickly. Walter Smith's coming back. That felt right. It felt just, that's safe pair of hands. That's the symbol of this season now, as Walter comes in and steadies the ship.
Aye, and that was that is when we spoke about what we needed when McLeish was leaving. We needed to try and revitalise and revamp what we needed done. Murray did get this one spot on. It's one of the very, very few times I'm going to give credit to David Murray, but at that point in time, we needed somebody who can come in, steady the ship, get back to basics, and just, you know, bring a bit of unity into the club again. And he got this appointment spot on.
Yeah. Let's look back in the Le Guen era. What is the overall takeaways? What's the legacy of the Paul Le Guen period at Ibrox?
It's funny. Up until 10 years ago, I always thought the Le Guen era. Know what, Colin? It'll never be as bad as that again. how naive was I? And I think there's so much Rangers can learn from looking back at the Le Guen era and when you're taking a risk at a point, what to do, what not to do, how to approach it. We didn't learn with Caixinha. So that's two prime examples. So I'm hoping Van Bronckhorst doesn't go for a long, long time. But if we're going for another radical appointment, we've got very two prominent reference points here. But overall, Le Guen, it's just that depth, the absolute highest of excitements. And I'm genuine when I say all my time as a Rangers fan, I've never been, I don't remember being that excited over a summer period about what's going to happen, who we're going to sign, how good are we going to be, and then just a massive dip. So that was probably the highest of highs right to the lowest of lows.
And Murray, again, and we need to touch on this, Murray doesn't help him. Murray does not. I think he sells him a bill of goods and sells him that you'll just come to Ibrox, I'll look after you, I'll give you what you want, you'll be able to take over for Wenger in the future if you build it here. And he gives him 3 million and 3 players for Austria Vienna. And that's Murray's problem here at this point. Murray at this point, Murray wanted Paul Le Guen, he wanted to pursue Paul Le Guen, but when it came to helping Paul Le Guen, he doesn't. And Le Guen, obviously, it doesn't work out, but Murray just, and he gets away with it because Smith comes in and completely steadies the ship, but Murray deserves a lot of blame for this period, in my opinion.
You're spot on, and it's something that it doesn't get the blame. When we think about this 6 months Paul Le Guen's in charge, he firmly takes the heat for it. Even now, when we're like 16 years on, for me, as much as Paul Le Guen's got so much to blame for and so much he could have done differently, I lie more blame at the defeat of David Murray, because he was sold out a bill of goods, as you say. For the get-go, we've just got two completely different expectations. Well, the expectation is different for reality in terms of how he's going to be getting set up, and then it just for September onwards, it just handles it poorly, and it again, and this is so prominent through the Murray era. His biggest focus is saving face for David Murray, doing what's right for Rangers, and so I put more blame at David Murray than I do Paul Le Guen.
And as we say, this whole period is just a weird period in Rangers history. And next week in the show, we will take a look at what happened when Walter Smith came back for his second spell, completely steadying the ship, absolutely just revitalising the support. And we will obviously touch on that famous season in Manchester when Rangers nearly get to grips with European glory. Colin, thank you very much for joining me in this episode. It has been an absolute pleasure to go through this period. Well, maybe not pleasure is the right word, but it's certainly been an entertaining show to do. Thank you very much for coming on. I've really enjoyed it.
No, thanks very much for having me on, Scott. And you know what, it's been quite therapeutic. I've got a lot off my chest that's been lying there for 16 years. So, no, it's been fun looking back at it. It's far enough away now we can have a laugh and a joke about it. But no, it's been
absolutely.
a pleasure, mate. Thanks
It's been a
for
pleasure to have you on. Thank you very much, and thank you very much to everyone that's tuned in. Join us on the next part of the Rangers journey.